A man who once commanded an entire prison lay doubled over in his office chair, clutching himself in agony. His face was pale, drenched in sweat, his breath ragged and shallow. Moments earlier, he had been pacing with the confidence of a king in his castle. Now, he was screaming, a sound that echoed down the empty corridor, rattling the metal doors of men and women who had once feared him. This was Warden Darius Holloway, the highest authority inside an Alabama correctional facility. For more than 2 decades, he moved with an air of untouchable power. Guards saluted, inmates lowered their heads, and no one dared question his word. But in those early morning hours, his body was betraying him in a way even veteran doctors would struggle to explain. The very symbol of his manhood, his pride, his weapon of control, was rotting away before their eyes. How did the most feared figure inside those prison walls collapse in such humiliation? What chain of choices brought him to this point? Broken, gasping, his screams muffled only by the sound of rushing footsteps. And why, out of all nights, did this happen after a late-night visit to a 72-year-old inmate's cell, a woman forgotten by the world, frail in body, but carrying with her something he never expected? This is not just the story of a prison scandal. It is the story of unchecked power meeting a consequence so brutal, so unthinkable, it forced the entire state to stop and question everything they thought they knew about justice. And as you hear this, you'll find yourself asking the same question thousands of others did. Was this tragedy, or was it justice finally answering back? If hearing this already makes your chest tighten, if you believe the truth about men who abuse their power must be told no matter how disturbing, don't scroll past this moment. Hit subscribe right now. And if you don't, then go to the comments and tell us why you're okay with letting stories like this be buried. Because silence has always been the greatest ally of men like Darius Holloway. What happened inside those prison walls on that August night was only the beginning. And before this story is over, you'll understand why the man who once thought himself untouchable ended up losing everything that made him who he was. Alabama, summer of 2019. The air was heavy with heat, the kind that clung to your skin and refused to let go. Inside the walls of Holloway Correctional Facility, the suffocating atmosphere was worse. No breeze touched the cells. No sunlight softened the concrete. Here, lives were measured in days and nights, numbers and files, punishments and silence. For the men and women locked away, every hour dragged like an eternity. To the outside world, they were statistics. To the prison itself, they were shadows. Forgotten voices. Families pleaded for reform. Reports had been filed about overcrowding, mold creeping across walls, untreated medical conditions, and guards who abused their authority. But in Alabama's prison system, the complaints barely left the paper they were written on. It was a system designed to grind down the human spirit until nothing was left but obedience. Survival inside wasn't about strength, it was about invisibility. Stay quiet, stay unnoticed, and maybe you'd make it to the end of your sentence. At the top of this pyramid of silence was Warden Darius Holloway. To the public, he was celebrated as the man who kept one of Alabama's toughest facilities under control. Politicians praised him. Community leaders called him disciplined, efficient, a man who got the job done. In front of cameras, he was polished, tailored suit, sharp haircut, confident smile. But inside those prison walls, the story was very different. Holloway ruled through fear. His gaze alone was enough to freeze inmates in place. Guards, even those with a conscience, fell in line. They knew better than to question him. A man like Holloway didn't just have authority, he embodied it. At least, that's how it seemed. What people didn't see, what remained hidden for years, was the trail of whispers left behind him. Whispers of women summoned in the dead of night. Inmates who spoke out mysteriously disciplined. Files misplaced. Guards who looked away. He carried out his misconduct like a ritual. Quiet, methodical, and without hesitation. Everyone knew, yet no one dared to speak. Holloway was untouchable. He had turned silence into a weapon, and silence became the prison's law. Loretta Gaines knew silence better than anyone. At 72, she had outlived many of the women who entered the system with her. Once, she had been a nurse, a woman who tended to the sick, bandaged wounds, and gave comfort in moments of fear. But a financial crime, a mistake in her later years, stripped her of her career and placed her behind bars. Frail, stooped, with arthritis twisting her hands. She became invisible to the staff. To them, she was no threat, just an old woman waiting for her time to pass. Her days were spent shuffling through routines, lining up for meals, sitting quietly in the yard, returning to a cell that was more coffin than home. Yet inside that fragile body was a resilience born of decades of hardship. Loretta had survived poverty, the loss of loved ones, and a justice system that had never been kind to women like her. She spoke little, but she saw everything. And she had learned something that Holloway never understood. Silence could also be a shield, a way to endure, a way to wait. August 14th, 2019 began like any other day inside the prison. Guards moved sluggishly through their rounds, the weight of summer pressing down on their uniforms. Inmates shuffled between work details and cells. By nightfall, the building exhaled into its uneasy rhythm, the clang of doors, the shuffle of feet, then stillness. Midnight came, and with it, the warden's walk. Holloway often used the cover of night to move unnoticed. He claimed it was about discipline, catching inmates off guard. But for those who had endured his shadow, it meant something else. Fear. That night, his footsteps stopped outside Loretta's cell. The guards nearby said nothing. They had seen this before, or at least something like it. A key turned. The door creaked open. Holloway stepped inside. Loretta stirred awake, startled by the figure towering over her. For a moment, confusion clouded her eyes. Then came the recognition. She knew what was about to happen, and dread filled her chest. In her later testimony, she said, "I was too old to fight him. I just closed my eyes and prayed it would end." What followed was an act of violence hidden beneath the disguise of authority. Holloway had power. Loretta had none. And when he left her cell hours later, locking the door behind him, he carried with him a smugness that had accompanied him for years. To him, it was just another night, another secret swallowed by the walls. He straightened his uniform, adjusted his belt, and walked down the hallway with the same authority as always. He believed the night had ended in silence, as it always did. But it hadn't. As dawn crept over Montgomery, Holloway sat in his office, reviewing reports with the same meticulousness he was known for. But something was wrong. A twinge of pain in his abdomen. He shifted in his chair, trying to ignore it. Minutes later, the pain sharpened, crawling downward with an intensity that left him breathless. He pressed his hand against his stomach, sweat beading on his forehead. By 4:17 a.m., his body was shaking uncontrollably. He doubled over, gasping for air, clutching himself in agony. His screams carried through the halls. Guards rushed to his office, stunned to see the man they had feared for years now crumpled like a broken doll. Paramedics arrived, pushing through the gates with urgency rarely seen for inmates. Holloway was different. He was the warden. He was supposed to be the protector of order. Now he was a patient, writhing in pain. As the ambulance tore through the streets toward Montgomery General Hospital, Holloway's cries echoed against the walls of the vehicle. Even the paramedics, hardened by years of emergencies, exchanged uneasy glances. Something about this was unlike anything they had seen. At the hospital, doctors surrounded him, their faces etched with disbelief. Holloway's condition was deteriorating at a terrifying speed. Tissue in his lower body showed signs of necrosis, rotting flesh spreading hour by hour. Surgeons scrambled, nurses whispered, and the man who once commanded an empire of silence was reduced to a shivering figure on a hospital bed. His body was failing, his pride disintegrating. And yet, in that moment, no one knew why. The cause of his collapse remained a mystery. Back at the prison, Loretta sat on her bunk, hands folded in her lap. She said nothing. She watched the light seep in through the bars, a faint glow of another morning. For years, she had been invisible. For years, her voice had been ignored. But that night, in a way no one yet understood, her silence had spoken louder than Holloway's power ever could. The collapse of Warden Darius Holloway was not just the downfall of a man. It was the beginning of a reckoning, one that would expose the rot hidden in the very walls of Alabama's correctional system. And soon, investigators would learn that the answers weren't only in his failing body, but in the testimony of a 72-year-old inmate who had been overlooked for far too long. Because what happened that night wasn't just another abuse hidden in the shadows. It was the moment the silence cracked, and the forgotten voices began to be heard. When Warden Darius Holloway was rushed into Montgomery General Hospital, the doctors were left baffled. They worked in silence, exchanging uneasy glances as they saw the damage spreading across his body at a speed that made no sense. They called in specialists, ran cultures, and ordered every scan possible, but the conclusion was undeniable. This was not an ordinary infection. It was eating him alive, faster than their medical training prepared them for. What they did not yet know was that the answer to his collapse lay back inside the prison, in a small concrete cell belonging to a woman no one had listened to for years. The investigators dispatched from Montgomery arrived at Holloway Correctional Facility less than 48 hours after the incident. Officially, their job was to review his medical condition and assess whether anything in the prison environment might have contributed to his sudden illness. Unofficially, the whispers had already started. Guards mentioning that Holloway had been seen outside an inmate's cell long after midnight. The name Loretta Gaines whispered among staff like a curse. If the rumors were true, then this wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a scandal that could shake the entire department to its core. When the team entered Loretta's cell, they expected to find nothing. To them, she was a frail 72-year-old woman with no power, no weapons, and no reason to be dangerous. What they found instead stopped them cold. Beneath her thin mattress and tucked into an old shoebox were a series of jars, bottles, and makeshift containers. Some were filled with cloudy liquids, others with pastes that smelled harsh and unfamiliar. A guard muttered under his breath, "What the hell is this?" The lead investigator collected them carefully, labeling each one before sending them for testing. At first, they assumed these were harmless folk remedies. Pain relievers she had mixed together because the prison medical staff had long ignored her requests for treatment. But the results told a different story. Laboratory analysis confirmed that several of the mixtures contained highly toxic compounds. Some were caustic, capable of burning flesh on contact. Others were combinations of chemicals that, if transmitted into the bloodstream, could trigger aggressive bacterial infections and tissue death. Investigators debated among themselves. Had Loretta accidentally created these dangerous concoctions, or had she known exactly what she was doing all along? And if she knew, did that mean what happened to Holloway was an act of deliberate resistance, or was it an accident born of desperation? The question would hang over the case for years, but one thing was certain. The evidence in her cell linked directly to the nightmare unraveling inside Holloway's body. When Loretta was brought into the small interrogation room, the officers expected tears, denial, maybe even fear. What they got instead was silence. She sat calmly, her frail hands folded neatly on the table, her back straight despite her age. Her eyes met theirs without flinching. When asked about the warden, she took a long pause before speaking. "He came into my cell," she said softly. "He told me no one would believe me, that I was nothing, just another number. I prayed he would leave, but he didn't." Her voice cracked, but only for a moment. Then came the words that would shift the entire investigation. "And now he's the one no one believes." The weight of her testimony could not be overstated. For years, whispers of Holloway's misconduct had circulated inside the prison, but no inmate had dared to speak publicly. Complaints were buried. Evidence was lost. Guards who hinted at his actions either fell silent or were forced out of their jobs. But now, in the wake of his collapse, Loretta's words struck like lightning. She wasn't just accusing him of abuse. She was connecting his downfall directly to that abuse, exposing the hypocrisy of a man who had terrorized women from behind a badge. The investigation widened. Other inmates began to murmur. A few found the courage to admit that Holloway had summoned them under false pretenses in the past. Some recalled the fear of hearing his footsteps at night. Guards admitted, quietly and off record, that they had long suspected something but had been too afraid to speak. The picture forming was one of a man who had hidden behind authority for years, committing violations under the cover of silence. As the details leaked beyond the prison gates, the media seized on the story. The headlines were merciless. Alabama warden falls to mysterious illness after nighttime encounter. Abuse of power ends in humiliation. Elderly inmate breaks silence. The public couldn't look away. Cable news ran the story on repeat. True crime podcasts dissected every detail, and social media platforms turned Loretta's name into a symbol of resistance. #spread, #Loretta's truth, #justice in prison. The rotting warden. Civil rights organizations demanded action. Former inmates across the state stepped forward, some recalling similar abuses from other wardens, others speaking about systemic failures that allowed men like Holloway to operate unchecked. Family members of incarcerated women held rallies outside the prison, carrying signs that read, "Protect the vulnerable," and "No more silence behind bars." The scandal had broken through the walls, and for once, the voices of the forgotten were being amplified on a national scale. But not everyone agreed on what had happened. Some argued that Loretta had intentionally laced her remedies as a form of protection, suggesting that she had prepared for a moment like this. Others insisted it was fate. That Holloway's collapse was a tragic but poetic coincidence. Debates raged on talk shows and in living rooms. Was this divine justice? Was it calculated revenge? Or was it simply the universe answering back? The ambiguity only fueled public fascination. Meanwhile, in Montgomery General, Holloway's condition worsened. Surgeons performed multiple operations, cutting away infected tissue in a desperate attempt to save his life. But nothing could restore what he had lost. Within weeks, he was permanently impotent, his body scarred beyond recognition. The man who once walked with arrogance now sat in a hospital bed, gaunt, weak, and humiliated. Nurses whispered about his fall from power, unable to reconcile the image of the commanding warden with the broken patient before them. The Department of Corrections had no choice but to act. Holloway was placed on medical leave, then quietly pressured into retirement. His career, once decorated with praise and promotions, ended in disgrace. His name, once spoken with respect in state circles, became a punchline, a cautionary tale whispered in training rooms. But the true devastation came when he faced investigators again, this time too weak to posture or intimidate. With the evidence stacked against him, with Loretta's testimony ringing in his ears, Holloway confessed. In a trembling voice, he admitted what he had done. "I thought I was untouchable," he said, barely audible. "I thought nobody would ever speak. That night, I lost everything." Those words became the final nail in his legacy. They spread across the news, played in courtrooms, repeated in living rooms. For years, people had suspected. Now the predator himself had confirmed it. And in his confession, he acknowledged the one truth he had spent a lifetime denying. The voices he silenced were real. For Loretta, the aftermath was both empowering and devastating. She was moved to another facility for her safety, but she was no longer invisible. Advocacy groups championed her as a survivor who had exposed the truth. Her name appeared in articles, documentaries, and speeches about prison reform. For the first time in decades, she was heard. Yet, she carried the weight of it all quietly, never calling herself a hero. She told reporters only once, "I didn't mean for it to happen this way. But maybe now, people will listen." Darius Holloway's downfall was more than the collapse of one man's body. It was the collapse of an illusion, that authority could shield a predator forever. It forced Alabama to look at its prisons not as places of order, but as breeding grounds for unchecked power. The man who once silenced others had become the ultimate warning, that silence always finds a way to speak. And as the public reflected on the scandal, one haunting question lingered in every conversation. Did Holloway get what he deserved, or was this simply a tragedy that revealed too much about who we allow to hold power? When the story of Loretta Gaines finally reached the outside world, it spread with a force no one inside Alabama's correctional system could control. For decades, she had been a number, an afterthought, a fragile woman dismissed as powerless. But after the collapse of Warden Darius Holloway, the world was forced to hear her name. She became more than an inmate. She became a voice, a symbol of what happens when silence refuses to stay buried. Her life inside prison had always been one of endurance. Loretta never fought to be noticed. She spent her days in the background, moving slowly with her arthritis, tending to her fellow inmates with the scraps of medical knowledge she still carried from her days as a nurse. When someone complained of pain, she mixed makeshift bombs from what little she could find. When someone coughed through the night, she tore strips of cloth to help them breathe easier. These acts of quiet care made her respected inside the walls, but they did not make her visible outside them. For the state, she was just another elderly woman serving time. For Holloway, she was just another body in a cell, one he thought he could violate without consequence. Yet in the end, It was precisely her invisibility that became her power. After the investigation and Holloway's disgrace, Loretta's situation changed dramatically. She was moved to a different facility for her safety. Administrators feared retaliation, both from staff who had once protected Holloway and from inmates who might see her as a target for revenge or notoriety. The transfer was quiet, handled at night, with no public notice. But even in her new prison, Loretta remained who she had always been: humble, soft-spoken, and cautious. She did not gloat about Holloway's downfall. She did not call herself a hero. She carried the weight of her testimony as if it were both a shield and a burden. In 2022, after her health worsened and her body could no longer endure the harsh conditions, she was quietly granted release on medical grounds. The day she walked through the gates, her steps were slow, her back hunched, but her eyes glistened with the kind of strength only survival can give. Her grandchildren wrapped their arms around her, tears streaming down their faces. For them, she had been gone for more than a decade. For her, freedom felt like both a gift and a reminder of what had been taken. Cameras captured her exit, but she did not wave. She did not smile for the lenses. She simply whispered, "I'm going home." Loretta's release became a symbol in itself. Advocacy groups called it a triumph of perseverance. Journalists used it to highlight the failures of Alabama's prison system. Lawmakers were pressured to act, and hearings were convened to address the abuse, neglect, and corruption that Holloway's case had laid bare. Nonprofits launched new initiatives to investigate conditions in correctional facilities across the South. Families of incarcerated women began speaking more boldly, sharing their own stories of mistreatment. For the first time in decades, the silence was breaking. But with that reflection came discomfort. How many Holloways had gone unchecked for years? How many Lorettas had been silenced, their stories buried in files marked unsubstantiated or unverified? Experts pointed to the system itself: overcrowding, underfunding, poor oversight, and a culture where power often meant immunity. Guards described the pressure to stay quiet, to obey, to protect their jobs at the expense of their conscience. Former inmates testified about the humiliation and fear they endured, stories eerily similar to Loretta's. The picture was undeniable. Holloway was not just one man. He was the product of a system that had enabled him. The reflection spread beyond Alabama. National commentators debated what real justice looks like. Some argued that Holloway's downfall was poetic, that his humiliation matched the harm he caused. Others said it was a tragedy of negligence, that only when a man of power suffered did the state begin to pay attention. Professors used the case as a teaching point in criminal justice classes. Pastors spoke of it in sermons as an example of how arrogance is always punished in the end. And across living rooms in America, ordinary people shook their heads, some in anger, some in disbelief, some in shame that such abuses had gone on so long unnoticed. For Holloway himself, the years after his collapse were a descent into obscurity. He lived in retirement, scarred and broken, a man who once commanded fear now reduced to a cautionary tale. The power he had wielded evaporated overnight. Nurses tended to him without reverence. Neighbors looked away. His name, once spoken in respect inside state offices, became a reminder of humiliation. He rarely left his home, and when he did, he carried himself differently, not with the swagger of authority, but with the fragility of someone who knew the world no longer bowed to him. In one of his last official interviews during an internal review, he finally spoke without bravado. His voice shook as he admitted, "I thought I was the strongest man in the room. I thought my badge made me untouchable, but strength without mercy is nothing. That night, I lost everything." His words carried regret, but they came too late for the women he had harmed. They came too late for the inmates who endured his abuse in silence. And they came too late to save his name from being forever tied to the image of a man whose pride decayed along with his body. The ending of this story is both sweet and shocking. Sweet because Loretta, who had been written off as powerless, lived long enough to walk free, to breathe the air of freedom, to feel the embrace of her family. Shocking because the very man who once thought himself untouchable lost the thing he valued most, in a way so humiliating that the world could never forget. Their fates crossed in a way that no one could have scripted. One emerged from the shadows with her dignity, the other faded into them stripped of his. But this story is not only about two lives. It is about us. About what we allow when we stay silent. About what we ignore when complaints are buried. About the cost of leaving power unchecked. Loretta's case forced Alabama and the nation to confront the question we too often avoid. Does justice apply to everyone, or only to those without power? And if it only applies to the powerless, is it justice at all? Now as you listen, ask yourself, how many voices like Loretta's are still locked away, unheard, waiting for the moment someone will finally listen? How many Holloways are walking the halls of authority right now, believing their actions will never catch up to them? These are not distant questions. They belong to our prisons, our schools, our offices, our neighborhoods. Silence is not neutral. Silence is a choice. And every time we ignore it, we protect the predator, not the victim. If this story has stirred something in you, if you felt the anger of what Loretta endured, if you felt the sting of Holloway's arrogance, if you felt relief at his downfall, then do not be silent. Hit subscribe right now. Do not click away and pretend you never heard this. Because silence is what allowed Holloway to thrive for so many years. Silence is what kept Loretta invisible. And if you listen to this story and remain silent, then you have chosen their side, not hers. If you disagree, go to the comments and tell us why. But if you know in your heart that voices like Loretta's deserve to be heard, then subscribe, share this story, and refuse to let silence win again. This is not just another documentary. It is a reckoning. A reminder that power without accountability destroys, and that truth, no matter how long it is ignored, always finds its way to the surface. And now the choice is yours. Be another bystander, or be the voice that says enough.